Boston Mountains, Arkansas, October 1871. The air was sharp with the coming frost, and the hickory leaves fell like gold coins onto the forest floor. In a small clearing dominated by a single, colossal white oak, Matej Kovar worked. The tree was an ancient thing, a survivor of fires and lightning strikes that had hollowed its core decades ago, leaving a gnarled, living fortress nearly 12 feet thick at its base. While other settlers were laying up the last courses of stone for their chimneys or daubing a final coat of mud and horsehair into the chinks of their log cabins, Matej was inside the tree, scraping away rot with a cooper's adze. Silas Bream, the man who had built half the cabins in the valley, stopped his wagon on the track above the clearing. He was a broad, confident man whose hands looked like they were carved from the same timber he worked. Beside him, Caleb Finch squinted, leaning on his rifle. "What in God's name is the Bohemian doing now?" Finch asked, his voice a dry rasp. "He's making a den for himself," Bream said, a note of derisive pity in his tone. "Like a badger. Told him last week a man needs a proper hearth, 4 square walls." He just nodded and went back to scraping out that stump. Bream spat a stream of tobacco juice. "It's pauper foolishness. A man who lives in a tree has given up. He'll freeze before the new year, him and that little family of his." The mockery traveled easily on the crisp autumn air. Matej heard it. He stopped his work, the rhythmic scrape of steel on wood falling silent. He looked out through the jagged opening that would become his door, his face calm, his eyes steady. He didn't shout back. He didn't defend himself. He simply watched the men on the ridge for a moment, then turned and resumed his work. The scraping began again, a quiet, stubborn sound against the vast silence of the Ozark Hills. The men saw it as the work of a fool, the last resort of a destitute immigrant. They saw a man carving out his own tomb. What did this Bohemian cooper, a man who built barrels for a living, understand about the physics of convection that a seasoned frontier builder, a man who had weathered 20 Arkansas winters, had so completely missed? To understand the answer, and to understand the quiet revolution that began inside that hollow oak, you have to understand the invisible enemy that killed more settlers than bears or disease. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of warmth that we still use in our most advanced buildings today. In return for that knowledge, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you don't miss stories of the quiet geniuses who changed our world. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Matej Kovar was not a frontiersman. He was not a hunter, nor was he a carpenter in the way the men of the Boston Mountains understood the term. He was a bednage, a cooper from the forested hills of Bohemia. His entire life before crossing the ocean had been spent in the service of the carve. His hands knew the precise pressure needed to bend a stave of white oak without breaking it, the exact angle to shape the edge for a joint so tight it could hold wine for a decade without weeping a single drop. He thought in terms of vessels, not structures. His world was one of hoops and staves, of bungs and seals. He didn't build things to stand against the wind. He built things to contain a pressure, whether it was the ferment of new beer or the simple stillness of air. He had brought his wife, Anka, and their 2 small children, Jacob and Sophie, to America with the promise of land. They had arrived in Arkansas with little more than his tools and an unshakable belief in their own endurance. That belief was nearly broken by their first winter. They had spent it in a hastily built sharecropper's shack, a single-walled box of green pine, built to Bream's standard design. It was a structure designed to be erected quickly, not to be lived in warmly. That winter became a series of escalating miseries. Matej kept the fire roaring, consuming a mountain of wood, but the heat seemed to vanish the moment it left the hearth. The problem wasn't the cold outside, it was the cold inside. The wind didn't just rattle the shutters, it breathed through the walls. Anka would wake to find a delicate lacework of frost on the blankets covering the children. Their boots, left by the fire, would be frozen stiff by morning. A cup of coffee poured steaming from the pot was lukewarm before she could take a second sip. It was a cold that got into the bones, a damp, life-stealing chill that no fire could defeat. Matej watched his son Jakub's persistent cough and the pale, pinched look on his daughter Zofie's face, and he knew he was failing. He was feeding a fire, but he was not warming his family. The cabin was not a home, it was a sieve. That spring, as he walked the plot of land he'd finally purchased, he saw the giant, hollow oak. And he didn't see a dead tree or a fool's shelter, he saw a barrel, a very, very large barrel, standing on its end, already built from the finest white oak in the world. He saw a vessel. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of materials. It was a failure of understanding. Silas Bream and men like him built strong houses. Their dovetail notches were tight. Their roof beams could hold a mountain of snow. They saw winter as an enemy to be fought with brute force, the force of a massive, roaring fire. Their entire strategy was based on generating more heat than the winter could steal. The problem was, they never addressed the thief. The real enemy wasn't the temperature, it was convection. A typical cabin, like the one the Kovars had barely survived in, contained about 1,200 cubic feet of air. The walls were a matrix of tiny, invisible cracks. Cold, dense air pressed in through gaps in the chinking, gaps around the doorframe, gaps in the floorboards. This cold air, being heavier, would sink to the floor, creating a constant, imperceptible river of cold around their feet. This river displaced the warmer air from the fire, pushing it upwards. The rising warm air, now pressurized by the influx of cold air below, would then escape through the gaps in the gables, and the poorly sealed chimney flue. This constant cycle, this engine of air movement, is convection. The settlers were living inside a machine designed for the express purpose of exchanging warm air for cold. They weren't just heating their cabin. They were attempting to heat the entire state of Arkansas, 1 cubic foot of air at a time. The flickering of a candle flame in a sealed room was the telltale sign. The flame didn't flicker because of a ghost. It flickered because it was in a draft. The entire room was a draft. This is why families like Caleb Finch's would burn through 10 cords of wood in a winter and still live with cold floors and icy corners. It's why Jedediah Potts, the blacksmith, a man who lived by fire, would complain that the only warm place in his house was close enough to the hearth to risk catching your clothes on fire. They were fighting the wrong war. Matej Kovar understood this in his bones, if not in the language of physics. A well-made barrel didn't leak, not a drop. If it could hold water, it could hold air. And if you could hold the air, you could hold its heat. His work on the tree was methodical, a master class in an ancient trade applied to a new problem. First, he spent a week inside the hollow, which was roughly 8 feet in diameter at its base. He cleared decades of accumulated leaf litter, animal nests, and soft, punky wood, getting down to the hard, dry heartwood. The interior was surprisingly sound, protected from the rain by the tree's own living canopy. The floor was the earth itself, which he leveled and tamped until it was as hard as brick. Next, he addressed the base. The giant exposed roots of the oak formed natural buttresses, but also created gaps where the wind could howl. He spent 2 weeks cutting thick bricks of sod from the nearby creek bank, heavy with clay and tangled roots. He laid them like masonry, packing them tight against the tree's base, building a sloping, earthen bank that rose 4 feet high, burying the roots and sealing the floor line completely. He was insulating the foundation, a concept utterly foreign to his neighbors. Then came the cooper's masterpiece, the door. He didn't build a typical plank door to hang on hinges. He built a plug. Using his finest tools, a froe to split the oak, a draw knife to shape it, he fashioned a round, slightly tapered door, 3 layers thick with insulating moss packed between them. It was designed to fit into the opening he'd shaped in the tree's trunk, not against it, but in it, like a bung in a cask. The further it was pushed in, the tighter it sealed. It had no latch, only a large wooden handle. To close it was to seal the vessel. Finally, he tackled the collar. The tree was open at the top, some 20 feet up, where a massive limb had torn away years ago. This was his chimney, but it was too large. He built a small platform inside, and with Anka's help passing materials up, he meticulously sealed the opening. He didn't block it entirely, but reduced it to a small 6-inch hole, using a careful lattice of branches, packed with moss, and sealed with pine pitch he'd rendered himself. It was just enough for the smoke from a tiny cook fire to escape, but not enough to create a powerful heat-stealing draft. Throughout this process, the mockery continued, escalating into a quiet, cruel shunning. When Matej approached Silas Bream about sharing a run to the mill for supplies, Bream turned him down flat. "My wagon's for folks with sense, Kovar," Bream had said, not unkindly, but with absolute finality. "I ain't hauling for a man building a squirrel's nest. It's bad for my reputation." The denial of shared hauling was a serious blow, a form of economic exile. Matej had to carry his few sacks of flour and cornmeal the 6 miles back to his homestead on his own back. Anka watched him, her heart aching with the injustice, but her faith in him unshaken. One evening, as he fitted the plug door for the 10th time, shaving a sliver here, adding a touch of tallow there, she came and stood beside him. "It looks strange, matey," she said softly, her Bohemian accent a warm melody against the Ozark quiet. "Mrs. Higgins asked me if we were living in a tree because we owed money." Matej stopped his work and wiped his hands on his trousers. He ran a hand over the curved surface of the oak. "This is good wood, Anka," he said, his voice low and certain. "It held itself up against the wind for 200 years. It will hold us." He wasn't defending his pride. He was stating a fact he understood in his hands. He was a cooper, and this was the finest barrel ever made. To understand why Matej's barrel was destined to succeed, we have to talk about numbers. The enemy, convection, is a thief that works by volume. Silas Bream's standard 12 by 14-foot cabin with an 8-foot ceiling contained 1,344 cubic feet of air. Every hour, on a cold and windy day, at least half of that volume, nearly 700 cubic feet of air, was being replaced by freezing outside air. To heat that much incoming air from, say, 10 degrees Fahrenheit to a barely tolerable 60 degrees required a staggering amount of energy, roughly 6,000 British thermal units, or BTUs, every single hour. A roaring fire in an inefficient hearth might produce 30,000 BTUs, but most of it went straight up the chimney. The cabin was a thermodynamic disaster. Now consider Matej's oak. The interior space was roughly circular, about 8 feet in diameter and 7 feet high to the platform he'd built. The total volume of air he had to heat was only about 350 cubic feet, 1/4 of the volume of a standard cabin. But the crucial difference was the rate of air exchange. With his sod-banked foundation, his plug door, and his carefully sealed collar, Matej had reduced the air exchange to a bare minimum, perhaps only a few cubic feet per hour. He had effectively stopped the thief. He had created a sealed thermal envelope. The thick, dry walls of the ancient oak had an insulating value, an R value, far greater than a chinked log wall riddled with tiny gaps. But the real genius was in the air itself. A small, trapped, unmoving volume of air is one of the best insulators in nature. Where would the heat come from? There was no massive hearth. The answer was simple: themselves. A resting human body generates about 350 BTUs per hour. 4 people, Matej, Anka, Jakub, and Zofie, were a small but constant furnace, producing 1,400 BTUs every single hour. In Bream's cabin, this heat was a single drop in a leaky bucket, whisked away instantly by convection. In Matej's sealed oak, it was a steady deposit into a well-managed account. This, combined with the heat from a single tallow candle and the passive solar gain from the low winter sun shining through the south-facing doorway when it was open during the day, was enough. He wasn't trying to fight the winter. He was simply trapping the warmth they already possessed. He had built a home that didn't leak life. That November, the winter came. It didn't arrive gently. It came in the form of a blue norther, a terrifying weather event on the southern plains. The sky to the northwest turned a bruised slate-gray color. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. A slicing wind brought a horizontal blast of sleet that coated every tree branch in a quarter-inch of clear, heavy ice. Then the sky cleared, the wind kept blowing, and the temperature plunged. For 11 straight nights, it fell below zero. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. At the Finch homestead, Caleb and his wife spent their days frantically feeding wood into a fire that seemed to give off no heat beyond a 3-foot circle. Their children slept in their coats, huddled together in one bed. The water bucket a few feet from the hearth was frozen solid each morning. The walls popped and groaned, and the wind moaned through the chinks, a constant predatory sound. At the pot's forge, Jedediah fought to keep his quenching tubs from freezing, solid, and splitting. His family lived in the 2 rooms behind the smithy, and the misery was acute. The cold metal of the forge seemed to suck the warmth out of the very air. They were exhausted, not from work, but from the simple, draining effort of not freezing. Inside Silas Bream's own well-built house, the battle was just as fierce. He and his wife stuffed rags into cracks they never knew existed. They hung heavy quilts over the doors and windows, but still, a fine powder of snow blew in under the main door, collecting in a ghostly drift on the floor. He sat before his own massive stone fireplace, a monument to frontier construction, feeling the heat on his face and the icy draft on his back, and cursed the strange, persistent cold. And in the hollow oak, there was quiet. When Matej pushed the heavy plug door shut, the world changed. The howling of the blue norther faded to a distant, muffled whisper. The air inside grew still, absolutely still. There were no drafts. A single candle flame on their small table burned with a perfect, unwavering teardrop of light. It was not warm like a summer's day. It was cool, perhaps only 50 degrees, but it was a steady, dry, and livable cool. The killing edge of the cold was gone. Anka could sit and mend a shirt without her fingers growing stiff. The children, Jakub and Zofie, could sleep under their wool blankets without waking to the feel of frost on their faces. Their breath plumed slightly in the air, but their bodies were warm. The proof of Matej's victory was small and mundane. On a small shelf, he kept a wooden pot of the axle grease he used for his wagon wheels, a mixture of tallow and pine tar. It was a substance notoriously sensitive to cold. In the Finch cabin, the grease pot was frozen into a solid, useless block. In the Kovar's oak, the grease remained soft, pliable, ready for use. It was a small thing, but it was everything. It was proof that they were living on the right side of the line that separated survival from suffering. On the 8th day of the Blue Norther, one of Silas Bream's mules, a stubborn creature named Jonah, broke through a fence and wandered off. Cursing his luck, Bream bundled himself in every layer he owned and set out to track it. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that clawed at any exposed skin. The air was so frigid it hurt to breathe. In his coat pocket, he carried a small lump of axle grease wrapped in cloth, which he used to treat the cracked hooves of his stock. After an hour, he pulled it out. It was no longer grease. It was a yellow, waxy rock, hard as stone. He tracked the mule for 2 miles, his beard stiff with frozen breath, his feet losing feeling inside his thick boots. The tracks led him toward the ridge, overlooking the Kovar place. As he crested the rise, he saw the mule. It was standing in the lee of the giant oak tree, using the massive trunk as a windbreak. And he saw the oak itself, a strange, silent dome of sod and bark against the frozen landscape. There was no plume of smoke rising from its top. By all rights, the family inside should be frozen solid. He pitied them, but he also felt a grim sense of vindication. This is what happened when a man ignored common sense. He trudged down the slope toward the mule, his body aching with cold. As he passed the tree, he stumbled, catching himself with a hand against the round plug door. And then he froze. He had expected to feel the bite of ice-cold wood, a cold as absolute as the rock face behind him. Instead, what his palm registered was nothing. The wood was not warm, but it was not frozen. It felt neutral, like wood inside a house. He pressed his face closer to the seam between the door and the tree trunk. He expected to feel a knife edge of wind cutting through the gap. He felt nothing. No draft. Only an impossible, faint sensation of warmth. It wasn't heat from a fire. It was the gentle, steady warmth of living bodies, a warmth that had no business existing in the middle of a blue norther. He stared at the door, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with everything he knew about building. A house without a fire in this cold was a tomb. A house without smoke meant a dead fire or dead people, yet he could feel this ghost of heat. Hesitantly, he knocked. The sound was a dull thud. After a moment, the plug door scraped inward, opening a slice of the interior. Matej Kovar stood there, holding the door. He was wearing a simple wool shirt, not a heavy coat. Behind him, Bream could see Anka and the 2 children sitting at a small table. They looked up at him, their faces calm, not the hollowed-out masks of people suffering from extreme cold. The air that spilled out wasn't a blast of heat, but it was profoundly different from the air Bream was breathing. It was still. It was calm. It did not hurt his lungs. "Kovar," Bream managed to say, his voice thick. "Bream," Matej replied, his expression unreadable. He made no move to gloat. He simply waited. Bream's eyes darted around the small, curved space. He saw the single, steady candle. He saw the blankets, dry and unstained by frost. His gaze landed on the small pot of axle grease on the shelf. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out his rock-hard lump of grease, holding it up. Matej glanced at it, then at his own pot, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The understanding crashed down on Silas Bream in that moment. It wasn't about the size of the fire, it was about the integrity of the vessel. The Cooper had seen the world differently. He had not built a fortress against the cold. He had built a vessel that held the warmth they already owned. Bream looked from the hard grease in his hand to the soft grease on the shelf, then back to the quiet, dignified face of the man everyone had called a fool. He couldn't find the words for an apology. Instead, a different kind of respect, the respect of one builder for another, found its voice. "How?" was all he could ask. Matej just gestured to the thick walls of the oak, to the tightly sealed door. "A barrel must not leak," he said simply. The story of that day spread, but not in the way one might expect. It became a piece of local lore, told over fires and at barn raisings. The tale was carried not by Matej, who never spoke of it, but by Silas Bream. At first, the other men laughed when Bream described the warm, smokeless tree. But Bream was their best builder, a man whose judgment they trusted. His conversion gave the story weight. He wasn't living in a tree, Bream explained to a skeptical Caleb Finch at a barn raising the following spring. He was living inside a principle. The rest of us? We're trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. Kovar just plugged the hole. No one else moved into a hollow oak. That wasn't the point. The innovation that spread was the idea itself. That spring, Caleb Finch, remembering the misery of the winter, spent a week banking the foundation of his cabin with thick sod, just as Kovar had done. He was shocked to find that the floor, for the first time, was not the coldest part of his house. Jedediah Potts, on Bream's advice, rebuilt his family's door. He made it thicker, and he tapered the edges so it wedged tightly into the frame, creating a seal instead of just a barrier. The persistent draft that had plagued their main room vanished. Silas Bream himself began to change the way he built. He started paying obsessive attention to the small things, to the sealing of the foundation, the fit of the windows, the chinking in the gables. His houses were still strong, but now they were also tight. He charged a little more, but he explained why. "A house costs what you pay for it," he'd say, "plus the cost of the wood you burn to keep it warm. My way is cheaper in the end." By the winter of 1873, a dozen families in the valley had adopted some version of Matej's principles, either by retrofitting their old cabins or building new ones. They all reported the same thing: they were warmer, and they were using a third less firewood. The cooper's secret was out. What Matej Kovar did in that hollow oak in 1871 was a primitive, intuitive form of what we now call building science. His sod-banked foundation was a form of slab-edge insulation. His tightly sealed collar was an early air barrier. His plug door was a high-performance, weather-stripped entry. He had, without any formal knowledge, created a nearly passive house, a structure so airtight and well-insulated that it could be heated primarily by internal gains and passive solar energy. Today, our most energy-efficient homes are built on the exact same principle. We use blower door tests to hunt for air leaks with the same obsessive focus that Matej applied to his door. We wrap our houses in advanced air barriers and pile insulation in the walls and ceilings. We are, in effect, all trying to build a better barrel, a vessel that doesn't leak the precious energy we put into it. The quiet Bohemian cooper, mocked for his foolishness, was a century ahead of his time. The frontier was a harsh and unforgiving laboratory. It didn't reward theories, reputations, or traditions. It rewarded what worked. A man could be scorned as a fool in October and hailed as a sage by March if his methods proved sound, against the brutal judgment of an Ozark winter. The lesson Matej Kovar taught his neighbors was profound, and it is a lesson we are still relearning today. Warmth is not a product of a bigger fire. It is the product of a better vessel. It is not about how much heat you can make, but about how much of your own you can keep. In the end, warmth starts not with a flame, but with a seal. It begins the moment you decide that the winter will no longer be allowed to steal your air. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like it. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other lost technologies do you think deserve more attention? Disclaimer: this video presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by historical building practices for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. The techniques and principles discussed are based on real historical and scientific concepts. Any application of these or similar techniques in modern construction should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and professional engineering advice. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.